Hello, and welcome to the Neurophysiology of Yoga for Addiction, Prevention, and Recovery. I'm Bergen-Cico. I'm a professor of public health and addiction studies at Syracuse University. The objectives for today's presentation are to help familiarize people with yogic and mindfulness-based practices for both prevention and recovery, to understand the role of mindful yoga in fostering resiliency and recovery and how to cultivate it. Understand also how trauma and addictive behaviors relate to one another. And so without being said, I guess that all of the approaches that we're looking at here are intended to be trauma informed, because that's often an important component associated with addiction, both from a prevention and a recovery perspective. Understand what the mindfulness-based practices are and how they can help to restore self-regulation, sense of safety, and resiliency. And then obviously to support the integration of these practices into your own personal lives and into the work that you do with others. Mindful yoga is an attention training used to cultivate self-regulation, concentration, clarity, and equanimity. And I love this image here on the right side of the screen where it has mindful or mindful. So kind of looking at the difference between sort of the human natural condition of the default mode network, where we often have much going on, as opposed to a dog's mind where they're in the present moment. Having said that, though, if you have a dog, or if you've ever seen one, when a squirrel goes by, they can easily get distracted. Self-regulation is really when we're looking at regulation of thoughts, behaviors, and also neurophysiology. And this element, when we're talking about in terms of the neurophysiology and our physical response to stress, is really important when we look at yoga as a prevention component and as a recovery component. They also both practices foster concentration, the ability to focus and stabilize one's attention. And again, that's important for keeping us out of the habit of letting our mind go where the mind wants to go and getting caught up in thoughts and not being in the present moment. And both yoga and mindful meditation help in terms of fostering the ability to direct one's attention to where we want it to be, where we need it to be. And hopefully that's in the present moment. And then the practices also help to foster a sense of what we would call sensory clarity, and understanding the connection between physical sensations and actions, physical sensations and thoughts, and being able to keep track of the components of sort of a sensory experience as they slowly start to arise. And this is really important when we also look at prevention of returning to use or prevention of returning to addictive behaviors. It said, because sometimes referred to as relapse, is that the relapse is kind of a factor that's well the way down the road from the things that contribute to the development of a relapse. And being aware and having sensory clarity around responses to stress, sensations, physical sensations, and thoughts leading up to when we're maybe at a breaking point is a really important component for recovery. And then both practices are really geared towards fostering a sense of equanimity, which is the ability to sort of be present and be with difficult feelings and emotions, not to become them, but to give ourselves a little bit of distance and to be calm in the presence of difficult experiences. So what do we mean by mindful yoga, and what does that entail? So mindful yoga is a non-pharmacological approach to managing some of the most common mental health related problems that are often co-occurring with addiction or contributing to it. And so if we're looking at anxiety, depression, traumatic stress, chronic pain, emotional pain, and it can also be very much an upstream prevention basis. So not only looking at the proliferation of mindful yoga in recovery communities and therapeutic communities, but also the prevalence of it with preschoolers and in school-based programs where it's really offers a primary prevention basis for fostering self-regulation. If you've watched my colleague Rachel Raza's presentation on school-based mindfulness programs, you'll see from some of the research that we did there that even with children as young as 3 and 5, they're able to significantly improve their emotional regulation and self-regulation skills in ways that students who don't have access to yoga are not able to. So the key elements of mindfulness-based practices, when we're looking at this, what do we mean? So one key element is meditation, which is attentional focus, often with an awareness on the breath. And the reason for being focused on the breath is that the breath is in the present moment. Body scanning, which helps us get in touch with somatic experiencing, focusing on sensations in various parts of the body, sometimes noticing that there's intense sensations and sometimes that there's no sensation at all. And then yoga, which integrates all of these elements through somatic engagement of the mind, body, and breath. So if we look at sort of the most researched and well-established mindfulness-based programs, such as mindfulness-based stress reduction, it essentially includes these 3 elements in weekly practice and in daily practice as well. And these practices are designed to develop an awareness of physical sensations and the connections of these sensations to our actions and thoughts. Really importantly, too, is looking at interoceptive attention and visceral body sensations. So that means looking at what's happening internally and not just in terms of, I might feel a pain in my stomach, but looking at the interoception and the sensing of how that relates to emotions, how that relates to and precipitates action. And this can be facilitated through daily practices of monitoring the breath, through daily engagement with yoga, and the like. The other piece is fostering an awareness of thoughts and behaviors and making that connection about what's really happening as opposed to being perhaps wrapped up in a story. And yoga, the movement practices can be very, very helpful in terms of providing a focus for being in the present moment, being aware, and helping to strengthen that training of the mind. We also, skillful yoga, when it's led by a facilitator, can help to provide people with some insights into themselves. So overcoming a challenging move, sticking with something that is difficult to do, self-forgiveness when you can't quite hold your balance or do a movement, and then also the recognition of personal growth. So where you started perhaps in week 1 and where you are in week 4 or 5 can be helpful in providing some personal insight about how do you take that practice into your life and off the mat. And then these practices are also designed to be an intentional opportunity for rest and restoration. So when we look at self-regulation and somatic experiencing and the key things that these carry across these practices, self-regulation, what do we mean by that? And it doesn't mean controlling yourself. It really just means developing the cognitive as well as the physiological abilities to regulate attention, emotion, sensation, and physical stress response. And there's help in terms of supporting long-term well-being. Somatic experiencing is being with what is happening in the moment, and this can be with regard to physical pain in the case of chronic pain. It can be with regard to emotions that are arising, and the integration of sort of a neurophysiological and psychological balance of how the mind and the body inform and influence one another. Somatic experiencing is also, particularly when we look at yogic practices, is really important in terms of helping to release stuck energy from trauma. And I think we're all familiar with some of the terminology about we carry our issues in our tissues. And we notice, when we're tense, we're physically tense as well as emotionally tense. And so to be able to sort of uncouple the body and the fear response from the stimuli that we're experiencing or how we're experiencing the environment and people around us can help us to regulate our nervous system. And in the absence of skills to regulate our nervous system, we turn to approaches that are reliable, although not always healthy. And so ways to alter our consciousness or our physical discomfort can be pills, alcohol, gambling, shopping, sex, all types of things that we now recognize are across this continuum and this wider spread understanding of addiction as not just substance use, but also behaviors. And the somatic experiencing provides the opportunity for physiological regulation. So observing what's arising, observing the feelings and sensations, and either sticking with or turning into those sensations in the moment. So this is just a diagram here that helps to show sort of the general sequence of the body scan that we use in mindfulness-based practices. And there's an intentionality of beginning with the left foot and left lower leg, moving then to the right foot, the right lower leg, and then moving upwards to the midsection, the upper torso, the head and the neck. And it can be a very brief, 5-minute body scan where you don't get too much into it, and then going up to as long as a 40-minute body scan where you spend a lot of time focused on each part of the body. And this is really helpful in terms of not only fostering and developing self-regulation and somatic sensing and awareness, but also getting back in touch with, it's an active way to help your attention follow and connect with the body. So this can be particularly helpful too for people who have limited mobility and may be resistant to some of the movement bases of yoga practices. I've had students and clients in the past who sometimes confuse yoga with religious practice in this context and are resistant, feeling that it is in conflict with their religious teachings. So I sometimes rephrase it to help them see it as really gentle stretching, and they're able then to move into doing yoga. But the body scan seems to be a relatively neutral aspect also, where sometimes people don't have the resistance to feeling that it's a meditation practice that might be at odds with their own religious practices. But what this is really helpful for too in terms of addiction recovery and addiction prevention is we know that for cravings related to whether it's food addiction or substance use, that there are changes in body temperature, there are sensations that we have when we're having a craving or when we're stressed. And this helps us to get into touch with really understanding where those are and being able to pinpoint them. So it can raise awareness of when a craving might be building, and it can also raise awareness when stress might be building. And then we can hopefully apply skillful strategies for maybe decreasing the response to both of those. The other thing that this helps us to do is to develop what we call metacognitive skills. So metacognition is really just thinking about our thinking or awareness of our thoughts, and coupling this with monitoring and tracking of sensations. And so in yoga, we'll often see that experience, if you're giving instruction for how to get into a particular move, there's also good instruction includes information about, paying attention to the point of resistance and working gently with that resistance so as not to foster injury, and observing it and sometimes moving a little bit through that resistance. But this requires tracking of sensations in the various parts of the body that are connected, and sometimes we're surprised by where we feel that resistance when we're doing a particular move. So becoming aware of sort of and monitoring the physical sensations in order to help stabilize the nervous system is helpful. And talking about it simply in the abstract is not particularly meaningful, but being able to embody it literally with physical practices can be very helpful. And monitoring and tracking, so such as through the body scan, or if you're doing through yoga movements, or monitoring and tracking our breathing, helps people to learn to identify the difference between sensations of turmoil and upset with sensations of balance within the nervous system. And so if they can identify turmoil and distress, and they're able to invoke and develop a sense of calm, that's something that they know they have with them that they can use when is needed. And that can be very empowering. And then as people learn to track and monitor sensations, they learn that they can intercept sensations at various time points and help to also connect with what does that sensation mean? Is it a pleasant sensation, a neutral sensation, an unpleasant sensation? And does it mean excitement and positivity? Is it distress, pain, discomfort? What is it? And so really having the nuanced insight to connect physical sensation and tracking of sensation with emotions and understanding what those are. And this can be helpful in terms of, rather than asking about emotions, feelings, particular experiences in someone's life, is that we're really helping to facilitate and just guide them through this connection and exploring those physical sensations without having to perhaps do some of the more in-depth psychoanalytic type of work. I'm sure that you're familiar with the concept of sort of the craving cycle or the habit loop, but I'd like to touch on this and to show how this can be helpful in terms of sort of reverse engineering our behaviors when we look at in terms of particularly addictive behaviors. And as I said before, that can include anything from, if we're looking at excessive alcohol consumption, opioids, food, shopping, gambling, you name it, lots of ways. And so the diagram here shows us where we have a trigger, a stress, a physical discomfort, and the natural human response is to find some relief for that. And so we crave and we seek and we look for some way to release the discomfort or the suffering. And so common ways when we look at addictive behaviors are engaging in some behavior that provides a sense of relief and a sense of pleasure. If we find that to be rewarding and gives at least some temporary relief, we learn in a contextual means of that this is beneficial. And so we repeat the habit, and it over time can become an addictive cycle in that regard. That's a very simplistic way of looking at it. So it's also something you can integrate into your discussion and your practices in yoga and meditation. And so if you're looking at where do you begin here with this, is you start to work on sort of the, sorry about that, work on first identifying what the potentially addictive behavior is. So here we go, looking at the potentially addictive behavior. So it could be food, drinking, technology, shopping, pill use, whatever. And then beginning to look back from there about what are the triggers that are associated with it? What are the things that precede this desire and the craving for this? And how do we respond to those stressors? Awareness of this connection gives people choice when the stressors come up again. And hopefully then through yoga and mindfulness practices, they can develop the skills necessary for taking that awareness and making it a choice point where they can start to change and engage in different responses to the stress or the trigger and start to strengthen other networks and habits and pathways. And this is really at the crux of the research that we've been doing around looking at what are the mechanisms of change with regard to mindfulness and yoga. And we'll get into the results of that in just a little bit. One of the other concepts that's really helpful and important here too, when we're looking at dealing with cravings, which is an important part of how we develop addictive behaviors, and also an important part of understanding how we reverse engineer and undo some of those processes. And so the urge surfing for relapse prevention or return to use is a helpful construct. And what it's kind of built around is the idea that you can't always stop the challenges in life and the difficulty or the waves that are coming at you, but you can learn to surf over those unpleasant feelings and experiences. And so what people find too, and yoga is such a great doorway into understanding this. So if you look at craving, what research shows us is that craving is a time limited experience, even though we may not think that at the time, but it generally has about a 15 or 20-minute window in terms of when we're looking at between the beginning of a craving, peak intensity, and then how do we drop out of that, or how does it dissipate. And so by observing and watching the craving experience, with each subsequent, as we see in the bottom diagram here, with each subsequent wave of a craving, the intensity dissipates. And so an analogy here when we're looking at in terms of yoga practices, if somebody's in a stretch that is, or a position that is particularly challenging and somewhat maybe painful or difficult, if they stick with that, they can watch and see how the intensity of that discomfort, provided they're not injuring themselves, but the intensity of using those muscles in a new way or in a new position will start to dissipate over time. And with each subsequent class that they come to and they practice, or each subsequent time that they try the move, they'll see the difficulty release a little bit, and they also develop some objective perspective with this. And so by observing and not suppressing per se what we're experiencing in terms of a craving, takes away some of the power from it. And that's wonderful. So the kind of basic 3 steps for urge surfing or craving surfing is looking at, first of all, we notice about locating the sensation of cravings in the body. So here again, where yoga and the somatic experiencing practices are so important in terms of getting in touch with what's happening in our body and noticing where one can feel it, noticing each place in the body where it's felt. And this is also where each particular move and the specifics of body scanning techniques and drawing our attention to each area can be helpful for really pinpointing where is that craving coming from, what's the origination for that. And choosing one of the strongest sensations to work with is it, and observing it, not again resisting it and not giving into it per se, but noticing it. Is there a sense, is there a temperature to it? Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it numb or tingling? Is it intense? Is it dull, sharp? And these same qualities can be used also with people who have chronic pain. And we know that chronic pain and addiction can often go hand in hand with one another, particularly when people are using potent pain medications such as opioids, and finding ways to manage that pain so that it doesn't become their central identity and it doesn't limit their life quality, but also that they don't have to take medications that make it difficult to be in the present moment and to function. So after locating it, investigating it, then the third step here in terms of urge surfing is just noticing what happens. And to notice, does the intensity, does the sensation, the craving intensify or diminish? Does it have one constant place that it's located in the body, or does it move? And did the qualities of the sensation change? And does your attention get distracted? And so these are all helpful ways in terms of focusing attention and investigating those difficult experiences, the curiosity. So you can build this into your yoga practices too, because sometimes people have the urge to simply pull out of a position or a move because it's difficult or feels a little bit too challenging. And so you can incorporate this language into what you're doing. What is helpful or wonderful too to find is that urges will pass all by themselves. No matter how strong they are, eventually they pass when we don't give into them. And they rise like ocean waves and crest and fall. And they're often the most intense just before they break. So when we have that sensation of, if I don't give into this, I'm not going to be able to get on with the rest of my life or my day or whatever and do anything else until I give into this. And if you make it through not giving into that urge or that craving at one point in time, it can be very empowering to then go back and start to recognize what are they feeling, have an awareness of it, investigate what's going on, and then not give into it, hopefully. And regular practice, again, that's one of the important things with all of these things is practice, practice, practice. One class or one session might pique someone's interest and give them some temporary relief, but continued practice is necessary to strengthen those neural networks along the way. So when we look at substance use and mental health sort of risk factors, and then look at sort of the prevention or the elements that we're trying to balance and develop here, the left side of your screen lists the things that are risk factors for developing addictive behaviors. And the right side of the screen are looking at what we call as protective factors. And so looking at trying to foster these protective factors through things like yoga and meditation helps, just like in terms of with yoga, you always do a counter pose or perspective to balance strength and flexibility. Same thing with when we're looking at identify risk factors and how do you balance and counter those with protective factors. So one key risk factor is an inability to tolerate distressing feelings. The other key side then is looking at developing distress tolerance. Poor self-regulation is a big risk factor. The counter to that is development of self-regulation skills. Emotional dysregulation and emotional turmoil are big risk factors. And the preventative factor that's a counter to that is psychological flexibility and emotional regulation. Rigid thinking is a big risk factor. And again, psychological flexibility is a counter perspective to that. And we see that time and time again in terms of the changes that come about through yoga and mindfulness meditation practices are the psychological flexibility that people seem to have in terms of responding rather than reacting and accepting change when it's not necessarily anticipated. Similar things with reducing anxiety, because anxiety can be a big risk factor, helping to reduce chronic and relapsing depression and be a preventative component for that, because depression is a risk factor for addictive behaviors. And then reducing traumatic stress symptoms and symptomology, because unaddressed traumatic stress is a significant risk factor for not only substance use and addictive behaviors, but a whole range of physical health and mental health challenges. Exposure to violence, including sexual violence, are substantial risk factors. And the protective factor is cultivating self-awareness, and it comes with that aspect of noticing what's going on in your environment and also how you're being impacted and affected by violence in your environment, giving yourself some permission to investigate around those things. It can also help in terms of breaking the cycle of violence. So all of this background coming into looking at what have we found specifically in terms of brain changes. And we found that mindful yoga is related to changes in neural networks in parts of the brain. And let's look at how they're particularly relevant to addiction prevention and recovery. So there's an important area of the brain that is that we found significant change in is the premotor cortex. So for people who are interested, that's the Brodmann area 6. And the premotor cortex is, as you notice, motor, has a lot to do with what is in anticipation of movement and what helps in terms of motivation and the like of physical movement. So here we're looking at fostering and strengthening interoception. And if we go back to the initial part of the discussion today, we're looking at how sensation tracking and awareness of interoception, body feelings and sensations are very important. And these are also important in terms of impulse control, and when we're looking at interrupting those elements of the habit loop, because prior to initiation of engaging in a particular behavior, the premotor cortex precipitates, well, there's activity there that precipitates that. So we found significant changes in this area. The other two areas that we found particularly significant changes in are under the larger area of what we call the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex is our new part of our brain. It's the front part of our head here. And that's very important as in an umbrella space of the brain, where we look at important for emotion, self-regulation, attention, and behavior regulation. And so two of the key areas that we found were the frontopolar area, where there was significant change only in the people who engaged in mindful yoga, and the orbital frontal cortex. And the orbital frontal cortex is very important in the center in the areas of the brain involved in what we call satiation, or the stop circuits in the brain. And with in addictive processes, this part of the brain is often not functioning well. So we have the go circuit and the stop circuit, and the go circuit is seeking, craving, has a drive for the substance, the behavior, whatever it is we're engaging in. The stop circuits help us to say, I've had enough, to eat, to drink, to buy, whatever it is that we're doing, and to regulate and control those impulses and foster satiety. And so it was super exciting to see that this area, the orbital frontal cortex, which is important for satiety, emotional regulation, it helps to integrate both somatic sensations that embody emotions. And it's very important in terms of stress physiology regulation, reappraisal, and attentional control of what's happening in the moment. So when we go back to reverse engineering the craving cycle and how do we work with that, this is an important piece for that area. So I don't believe you can see this particularly well because the text is small unless you have a nice big screen. But what I have here are areas of two important areas looking in the brain, and looking at from the research we did where we used functional near-infrared spectroscopy to measure neural networks in the brains of people who engaged in both mindfulness and yoga, and then a control group that age-matched control group that did not engage in mindful yoga. And so what we see here on the left side of the screen is that intentional control areas of significant change only in the mindfulness group, and we saw frontopolar area activation increased. We found that orbital frontal cortex activation decreased. And this may sound counterintuitive, but what we found here was that it required less effort to inhibit distraction and to maintain attention. And similarly for the premotor cortex. So it means that there was less effort. When we look at decrease in terms of activation, it means there was needed to be less blood flow, less activation in that area in order for people to inhibit the activity that they were involved in, which was helping to measure their attention in the present moment. On the right side of the screen here, what we see is also a image where I've highlighted with little blobs here, the key areas of the brain that were involved with emotion regulation that only changed in the intervention group. So the people, again, who practiced mindfulness and yoga. And I want to be clear here too, they practiced for an hour a week for 6 weeks. So we're not looking at long-term, these are novice practitioners, so to speak, people with high levels of stress and a history generally of trauma. And so in a short period of time, we found significant improvements also in terms of emotional regulation. And here we also see a decrease in terms of orbital frontal cortex activity and premotor cortex. The importance there is that it required less effort to inhibit or to regulate their emotions and to not get triggered and activated by the protocol that they were involved in. I've got the source here. You can look up the paper if you want to read the details. And I don't know that anybody does, but it was just published in 2021 in the Mindfulness Journal. And you can look under my last name, Bergen-Cico, or you can look at the name of the article, which was using fNIRS to measure changes in neural correlates associated with mindfulness-based practices. So the important thing here, all that work kind of narrows down here too, is we're looking at that the premotor cortex and the orbital frontal cortex influence one another. So here we're looking at the orbital frontal cortex is important for satiety and control and engaging the stop circuits of the brain, which are essential to inhibiting habitual behavior and essential to moderating intake or moderating a behavior, and that these are very connected with the premotor cortex. I think it makes sense that the premotor cortex would be involved and strengthened when we have a heavily engaged people in terms of focusing on body sensations, engaging in body movement such as yoga and body scan. And but it's really exciting to see with this technology that there's real changes happening in the brain. So what this also translates to is if we start to look at, so mindfulness-based yoga practices help to increase the areas of the brain where we saw changes are associated more strongly with what we call the task positive network. And the task positive network is really kind of like present moment focused attention. And when the task positive network is engaged, then the default mode network is more suppressed. The default mode network area of the brain is where our mind, if we go back to that first image we saw here, the picture of the mindful or the mindful with the dog and the human, and the human brain in that capacity is looking like the default mode network. So our brain is going where it wants to go, and we're letting our attention lead us wherever it may go. And the default mode network is a strong predictor of relapse. So Eric Garland has done some excellent work and research around looking at this, if you want to look into more of the work with that. And so by quieting the default mode network and strengthening the task positive network, this can be helpful in terms of supporting recovery. So that's what all of those things help us mean. The key thing too here when we look at, I want to touch on what are some of the key practices when we look at, for example, mindfulness-based stress reduction. So I talked about meditation, which focuses on awareness of breath, body scanning, and yoga. And the intentionality of, two elements, looking at intentional breathing, so making sure people are breathing in deeply, extending their belly, and then when they exhale, pulling the belly back in, really working with the diaphragm to pull and engage that. And the importance behind this is looking at that the activation of the sympathetic nervous system is engaged by when we're breathing in, and the activation of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is sort of the calming elements of our nervous system, is activated by breathing out. And so doing intentional breathing in and out, and sometimes breathing in for 4 and out for 6, and also helping people to learn the connection between breathing and body movements, as is done with good practices in terms of yoga, and using the breath as an anchor for the present moment, and also not recognizing the connection between breathing, movement, and sensation. And sometimes people will be aware of, I'm sure, when they're trying very hard in yoga, that sometimes they realize they're not breathing at all. There's not a lot of complicated yoga in the mindful yoga practices. And one of the most important things that we should work on with people is helping them to feel grounded, whether that's when they're sitting and meditating, or if they're doing yoga, or laying and doing body scan. And so some of the key things that we start out with, whatever the age group, is helping people feel grounded like a tree. And so using tree pose or mountain pose, where people are focusing on the sensations of the ground below them and really feeling grounded, and sensing that physical and actual literal grounding, and connecting it with their breath and getting a sense of safety. This, I'm sure you cannot read because I can barely read it myself, but it does show, I have the sequences here for what's the basic sequence for mindful yoga. And if they can make these slides available, I'm happy to share it with you. But it's basically, as you can see, some simplistic things. So we start with mountain pose, palm tree, shoulder stretches, raised arms, bending forward, low lunge, folding forward, low lunge, the raised arms pose, hands to heart, downward facing dog, triangle pose. And again, with all of these, we have so that you're doing the opposite side. You do, left foot forward, right foot forward, left arm up, right arm up. Cobra, which can be a more challenging one. Warrior two, extended side angle, warrior two again, extended side angle, and then some sequence going back and forth between downward facing dog, and warrior one, and then butterfly, a seated stretch. And then my favorite, which everybody feels successful doing this, is the corpse pose or shavasana, the end. So that can be a wonderful sense of accomplishment as well. So in conclusion, mindful yoga fosters self-regulation skills. And when we know that we can't stop the chaos that's often coming at us, but we can learn to surf, hopefully. And yoga and meditation techniques are modalities that are ultimately low to no cost, always with you, self-directed strategies for resetting yourself, tolerating anxiety and distress, intervening to reduce unhealthy and addictive behaviors. And these are some pictures from places around the world where I've worked, even when I didn't know the language, teaching mindfulness and yoga. And it can really be transformative and life-changing for people. People who are displaced can take it with them wherever they go. And mindful yoga changes neural networks in the brain. It strengthens our attentional control. This fosters resiliency in response to stress. It shouldn't say poor self-regulation, but it counters poor self-regulation and fosters self-regulation. And we know specifically that changes in the orbital frontal cortex occur in ways that help to strengthen sort of the stop circuits in the brain. And this can help to interrupt habituation for engaging in behavioral patterns. And in closing, I'd like to bring it back to a quote and observation by the late Thich Nhat Hanh. And we often see the image of the lotus flower in mindfulness spaces and yoga spaces. And what the lotus flower represents is that the lotus flower will only grow in muddy water. It won't grow in clear waters. And so as an analogy for when we look at addiction and sometimes the suffering and trauma associated with that can be part of people's lives, that it can also be a tremendous space and area and opportunity for growth. And it's out of the very ground of suffering that we can contemplate well-being. And it's exactly in the muddy waters that the lotus grows and blooms. And so it can be tremendously rewarding work to do. I thank you for your attention and your interest. My email is here if you would like to follow up with any questions. And it's dkbergen@syr.edu. And with that, I wish you well.